matter? What's the influence of your faith and how well you do in your medical journey? And as people of faith and the people of colour, we know that we do have quite a lot of links between our spirituality and our mental health and how we feel. So that's what we're going to explore today. And Dr. Joseph is going to give us a short presentation, but I'm hoping that this will be really interactive and you should participate and put your questions in the chat or join in. So we're hoping to have the discussion around the influence of spirituality and religion and its role in illness and recovery, and how spiritual behaviours can be manifested in the self-management of mental health. Are there any challenges or barriers in the management of mental health? And what's the role of health professionals when you go and see your doctor or your nurses in understanding spiritual encounters? And how do we support people as medics and nurses through these issues? So I'm once again delighted to invite Dr. Joe. Looking forward to your presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Ngozi, for that. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be with you all this morning. I don't know where you are, Ngozi, but I'm in Manchester and it's nice and sunny. So, yeah, I'm pleased to be back again to join everyone. And we are going to be looking at a rather complex subject this morning. This is a subject that is sometimes controversial, but in my opinion, it need not be. So by way of introduction, for those who may not be familiar with us, my name is Joseph Omofuma. I am a GP with special interest in mental health. I am also the pastor of Grace Community Church, a local church in Hulme here in Manchester. I'm an ordained reverend, as well as a fully qualified GP, and I manage to do both, amongst many other things. I also serve as the mental health lead for the Caribbean and African Health Network. So this morning, the challenge in front of us is to look at the connections between spirituality and mental health. And I'll just jump straight in by trying to first of all define a few things, if that's okay. So let's get this up, and I hope everybody can see my slide. So that just says who I am and what we're doing here. So basically, by way of definitions, and there's lots of different definitions that we can use, but spirituality this is a quote from a journal that I came across, and I thought it was quite apt to use here. Spirituality is used to refer to the personal, subjective side of religious experience. This journal was aiming to look at the difference between spirituality and religion, because very often, and I'm going to be doing that as well, these two terms are used interchangeably, but actually they're not exactly the same, and I'll explain. Spirituality and religion. So spirituality is used to refer to the personal, subjective side of a religious experience. Thus, religiousness represents an institutional, formal, outward doctrinal authorization, inhibiting subjective, emotional, inward, and unsystematic freeing expression. This is by some guy in 2011. Spirituality is your own, so basically, spirituality is your own personally held belief system or faith, as opposed to an institutionalized thing. Therefore, spirituality also involves or includes superstitious beliefs, cultural beliefs, etc., which, whether they are founded or not, but as long as it represents your own personal belief, then that's what it is to you. To remind us, mental health, my favorite definition of mental health, there's loads, is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her true potential and is able to cope with the normal stresses of life, work, and productivity, and make contributions to society. That's a positive mental health. So in the past, in terms of from the medical standpoint and from the medical world, spirituality has always previously been viewed as a negative, all right? So especially when it relates to mental health. So things like hysteria, psychosis, delusions, these were all considered to be more prominent or associated with people who were too religious or too spiritually inclined. So in the context of spirituality, if you developed psychosis, it was often thought that it was because you were too religious, and that's what has led you to where you are now. Such that any symptoms of depression, anxiety, stress in a spiritual person would often be met with cynicism and sometimes even criticism by medical individuals who look down upon such patients. Sadly, many of our colleagues, medical colleagues, still hold this opinion and still respond this way. I don't think that's the right thing to do, but that still happens till today. Now, to make matters worse, to bring it home to our own context, the Afro-Caribbean population is more likely to experience this than anybody else, in terms of the way we are responded to, simply because the Afro-Caribbean population are more spiritual. We have our roots, our very culture is embedded in spirituality. We are more inclined towards spirituality. We are more likely to believe spiritual things. And so you then find out that there is a thin line between the response you get from medical professionals. You're not sure whether is it because I'm Afro-Caribbean or is it because of the beliefs that I hold? In other words, is it because I'm Black or is it because I'm thinking this way? Sometimes it's a little bit of both. And I'm being very careful and measured in some of the things I say, because this topic is really very wide, but I want to try and bring it to our own context and sort of hone it down a little bit. The negative to some of this is that, and which is something that is true, is where our culture or our spirituality begins to attribute everything bad or every illness to some sort of spiritual problem. And I say it's a negative because, in my opinion, and from my own research, I found out that not every illness is caused by a spiritual problem. Because I'll give you an example, because I think I'm already answering some of the questions that have been posed earlier on. If everything was caused by spiritual issues, then there'll be no role for bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other pathogens that we now know exist. So when I started talking about spirituality, remember that I said this includes any sort of faith belief that you have. Permit me, if you may, to delve or to lean more towards my area of expertise, because I happen to be a pastor. Now, there was a gentleman called John G. Lake in the 18th century or early 19th century who helped in the discovery of germs. And he actually was a trained medical doctor who went as a missionary. And he found out that some of the plagues that were caused in certain parts of Africa were caused by pathogens, because if you separated the sick people from the well people, the disease spread was less. This is just a bit of history for your background. Point I'm making is not every illness is a spiritual problem, because we now know, we've always known for some time actually, that a lot of these have, there's a root cause to pneumonia, for example, there's a root cause to the things. And also, even some of the psychiatric symptoms, you can have bacterial meningitis, you can have viral meningitis that affects the brain, you can have fungus in the brain that causes problems, which can then present as a psychiatric or pseudo-psychiatric problem. We also know for a fact that things like lupus, and I hope I'm not running too fast, but I want to just get a few things out of the way. We also know that things like lupus, for example, systemic lupus erythematosus, we know that things like lupus even is a good one, that tends to affect females more, can also have central nervous system effects. In other words, you can have psychiatric symptoms from people who have lupus. Now, lupus is an autoimmune disorder that often affects women more. It can affect anybody, but it affects women more. And for some reason, it's very common in young women, young Black women for that matter. And so I had a case, because I like to give examples because it brings things closer home. I've had more than one now in the last 5 years, at least 3 that I know that I have been involved in personally, where the patient well, two categorically. One was kind of like half and half. The patient presented with psychiatric symptoms. They were hallucinating, they were seeing things, they were delusional. And some of you may laugh at this, but pastors were called in and prayed and things weren't happening. They got the psychiatrist involved. Somewhere along the line, I got involved. I also joined in the prayer. You know, I prayed, but somewhere along the line, it occurred to me, let's ask this parent, or let's ask this child a few more questions. It turns out that they had seen a GP a few months, well, a couple of years earlier on, and they had been referred to a rheumatologist. They had been prescribed medication. And the young lady, who was 18 or 19 at the time, had not been taking her medication. And so I said to parents, because now I got involved with this partly through CAHN. And I went with them to the ward round. This is one of the things that we do. We support you. I went with them to the mental health ward round because it was becoming a case of concern. This was a brilliant girl who was scheduled to study medicine and everything was going, you know, downhill very fast. And as you do, people began to postulate and say, oh, it's a spiritual problem. The enemies in the village have found them, etc. But I went with them to the ward round and I looked at the medication and I looked at the effects it was having on the girl. And I said to the consultant that, can we please do a re-referral to the rheumatologist again? Because I actually, what I didn't say to them is I had done some research. I spoke to a professor of rheumatology in Sheffield who happened to be a friend's friend. And we discussed at length. So by the time I went to the ward round, I was fully armed and, you know, informed. Initially, they were reluctant. To cut the long story short, as soon as the rheumatologist got involved, they immediately admitted this girl and started rheumatologic medication. And within a few days, I do not exaggerate, within a few days, all her so-called psychiatric symptoms disappeared. All of them. So we can then see here, classically, that the root cause, first of all, was not even a mental health problem, even though it manifested in form of mental health. I mean, she was hallucinating, she was aggressive, she was not recognizing people, she was babbling, you know, she looked like a crazy person. It was not a spiritual problem because we prayed. We got a lot of very powerful pastors. I prayed, and, you know, I believe in the power of prayer. But what it was just taking some time to listen, to fact find, and to try to get to the bottom of things. And we then found out that, you know, there was something else that was involved in this. So I started off saying, I said all that to say that not every mental health problem is a spiritual problem, and vice versa. Not every spiritual problem is a mental health problem. So let's just be aware of that there will be cases, that there will be times when certain things need to be looked at from the medical perspective, but there's also a place for spirituality. Now, there are certain people who, like I said, my colleagues who shoo everything that is spiritual, and I don't subscribe to that, because we know from knowledge that there are spiritual things that can affect it. All right. So these are some of the negative impacts that spirituality can have, because when you begin to attribute everything that happens around us, you know, to a spiritual problem. You know, there's a black cat on the wall. My son is coughing. Every winter he coughs, and you think that there's a curse on the family. No, the child may have asthma, you know, or, you know, they may have something called atopy, which predisposes you to things like that. So one of the problems with our community, with the Afro-Caribbean community, is the fact that we tend to over-spiritualize everything. I mean, we put a spiritual spin on everything. And that is the negative sometimes that can come from being spiritual, from people who are spiritual. I've spoken to many pastors, black, white, Aboriginal. I've spoken to different groups of people, and they all agree that the black people in their congregation are often very expressive in their spirituality. There's nothing wrong with that. The point I'm making, however, is that there has to be a balance. When we are spiritual, we cannot look at everything from a spiritual tinted glasses. And so that's just the point I was making. So let's balance this up by also looking at what are some of the positive effects, because there are positive effects. Apologies for that. I think I've shared the wrong screen there. What are some of the things that you get? This is going to be really short, and then we can look at some questions and look at some things that will help us to understand better. My colleague has already alluded to some of them, but I'll just go on. So positive effects. So there's a lot of research that has been done. Like I was saying, in the past, very little was understood, and even those that were understood were not really agreed to by the medical profession. You know, people thought that everything, the spiritual people tend to overemphasize everything, and you know, and that's why they are psychiatrically unwell, because of their spirituality. But recently, with more research, especially in the last 20 odd years, there's been a lot of research to show that people who are spiritual tend to have better outcomes if they are listened to. And that is the key to all of this. If it is recognized that actually this person has a spiritual leaning, and this is why they are thinking this way. So basically it calls for a better awareness in some of us to understand that actually I'm not crazy, I am spiritual. But also in our healthcare professionals to say, you know what, there needs to be, you need to explore something more than just medications and what you can see. There is a little bit more to it. So positive effects, I'll run through them quickly. Many have been found to have, this is from a paper that was released just 2 years ago, higher sense of purpose. You know, people who are spiritual tend to have that higher sense of purpose. Now, if you've ever listened to any of my talks on dementia, mental health, and things like that, you will notice that one of the things that happens very, very quickly when you're depressed, not dementia, depression, when you're depressed, is that sense of purpose, wanting to, the factor of wanting to go, that making meaning of life is gone. And that's part of the problem with depression, where you are not able to see tomorrow, where you're not able to see the betterness or light at the end of the tunnel. So that anhedonia, that lack of believing that things will be better for you. But for people who are spiritual, they found out that there was a higher sense of purpose, a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of hope and meaning of life. One of the hallmarks of depression is a loss of hope. Because when you begin to feel depressed, you feel that nothing good is going to come out from your life. They also notice higher confidence, greater self-esteem, better self-control, emotional intelligence. Now, this is really key and very important, a stronger sense of community, which ultimately helps in promoting well-being and reducing isolation. Some papers also found that this was actually done in the US, surgical patients who had a positive outlook, who were spiritual, who depended on a higher power, who had a positive mindset, they recovered faster, and there was a higher rate of recovery in surgical procedures. And so you see, also there was a church. I'm dropping a lot of things here, but please feel free to draw me back and ask questions. There was a church. This was in London, actually, very multicultural church. There's a research that was done. I don't know all the parameters that was used in this particular survey, but what they found out was there were 95%, and this church is about 10,000 of them in London, they were 95% less likely to develop anxiety and depression. The researchers who were not Christians put this down to the high tempo music, the positive messages that were coming out from the pulpit. They also put it down to a sense of camaraderie, fellowship, and togetherness, which a lot of people, if you know anything about London, don't experience when you're in a large city like London, and Manchester is fast becoming like that too. If you remember some of our previous talks, we talked about the fact that some of the risk factors or some of the things that make mental health worse is isolation. So all these things are now coming out, the medical science is now catching up to the fact that spirituality actually, while there may be some negative aspects to it, it's not all bad in itself. There are certain aspects of spirituality that actually help individuals to recover well, to have a better outcome, to have greater esteem, to, even less suicide and things like that. Because, for example, the Catholic Church, it's believed that it's a sin to commit suicide. And so you will hardly find any Catholic all over the world. Doesn't matter if they're Brazilian, Australian, or from Jamaica. They will, before they contemplate suicide, it will be very, very tough. So that is one good example of how spirituality helps us ultimately to hedge our mental health. Remember that I said, look, it's about what you believe. It's about the belief system that you have. And it is your belief system, whether right or wrong. At the end of the day, it's a belief system. One thing that I really liked when I was looking into this was they found out that any sort of belief system was better than none. Any. So whether you are Hindu, whether whatever, any sort of belief system was ultimately better than none in terms of outcomes, especially to do with mental health, because there were boundaries that were associated. In Islam, for example, there's a lot of boundaries associated with spirituality that makes it better. The converse side of it is that because of the stigma that is often found in Asian Black communities, you'll then find as a negative that people are less likely to come up with their illness. They're less likely to own up to mental illness. There's a lot of hiding, and people push things underneath. Families hide family members who are suffering with mental health. And so you find all these things. There's a lot of dynamics still going on. The point I was just making with all of that is there are lots of negatives, but there are also quite a few positives. Our job, or my assignment, is to help us, to be able to begin to identify those things more, and also to begin to think about how we can help both ourselves and people around us to be more aware of these things that can happen, and and to be more understanding, less judgmental, and more appreciative of what people are going through. Let me say this, I've said this before in previous talk, mental health is a real problem. It's a real issue. People who are going through mental health are going through a tough time. And I've said this, that there are varying degrees, even within the same illness. Depression in one person is not the same as depression in another person. There was a comedy skit, I think it was a South African chap, who was saying, "Oh, you got depression." All the kids, they're all depressed these days. All of them are depressed. Go sit somewhere. They're all depressed. I don't know why they're all depressed. They never went through some of the challenges we had. We went through apartheid and we are not depressed. But it's not the same. If two different individuals pass through similar experiences, how it affects one person is not how it's going to affect the other person, because we're all built differently. And so it's not fair to say, well, I was depressed and, nothing happened to me, so what's your problem? Or, I lost my house, I lost my mortgage, or I was abused as a child. Why are you not? It's terribly unfair and inconsiderate to look at it from that perspective, because even within the same spectrum of illness, within anxiety, within depression, it affects individuals in many different ways. And there are many different forms of mental illnesses. Some of them have a combination or a compounding effect. For example, somebody who suffers with psychosis also often has anxiety and depression as part of it. Now, if you don't recognize that and all you're seeing is the psychosis, you think, oh, this person is psychotic and all of that, forgetting that they also have a bit of anxiety, depression underneath, and that's not dealt with, it leads to problems. Let's not even talk about dementia. It's now been proven that most people who suffer with dementia have underlying depression as well. It goes hand in hand. And so when you see a relative or a friend or family member that's suffering with depression, and we then don't recognize or acknowledge or appreciate the fact that they're going through things. Because people with dementia, for example, I saw a lady just recently, they just started crying, and the wife couldn't understand. My big, strong husband, who was reliable, who was, the rock of the family, for no reason, in broad daylight, he just starts shedding tears. When we looked into it, he had developed early signs of vascular dementia. So really, it's about awareness. It's about appreciating things more. It's about us being more open-minded about this interplay. One is not exclusive of the other. It's another point that I want to make, there's nothing wrong with being spiritual. And, being spiritual doesn't preclude you from suffering from a mental health problem. Sadly, I know in the Christian religion, in many Pentecostal circles, people feel, or they claim that, if you are really spiritual, you really shouldn't be depressed. That's not true. That's not really true. Because for me, it adds to the misinformation about what depression really is. And like I said, circumstances of life affect people in different ways. And so, for example, take bereavement, someone who's lost a sister, someone who's lost a brother, someone who's lost a father, someone who's lost a mother. It affects individuals in different ways. And if you don't appreciate that, if we don't recognize that and are more understanding of that, then there's every likelihood that we will misinterpret that person's behavior. We will expect too much. That's why a lot of people then go underground, they hide their feelings. And unfortunately, the more you hide the feeling, the worse it becomes. That leads me very nicely to a very nice place here to say that if you know anybody, or if you yourself are going through issues around mental health, please don't hide it and don't run away from people. That's the worst thing you could possibly do. Why? Because it ain't gonna go away. And I'm saying this very, very cautiously, but just praying alone may not be enough. That's right, I said it. Praying alone may not be enough. Now, for some people, prayer may help them, and that's it. That's it. They're fine. But for some other individuals, they will need additional support. They will need to speak to a counselor. They may need to have cognitive behavior therapy. They may need to see a psychiatrist. They may need to come and see a GP like myself. So let's not judge the illness based on our own. Some of us are very strong-willed. Some of us are very good. I know people who have given up smoking or given up drinking just by deciding that, today I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to, and that's very good. But not everybody is capable of doing that. And we need to be able to recognize that we're all different. And so the fact that you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu, it doesn't preclude you from suffering with mental illness. And it's really important for us to say this. It doesn't mean you are less spiritual. I'll give you an example that I often give when I give these talks to churches and pastors. If you had a church member who had diabetes, for example, or who suffered with asthma, does that make them any less spiritual? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. We don't stigmatize these illnesses in the same way like we stigmatize mental health. If somebody had an amputation of his leg and had only one leg, does it make them less spiritual? It doesn't. So because of the nature of mental illness, because we can't see the ailment or the thing that's going wrong with the person, we often are less understanding. We often are quick to judge that, maybe the person is weak, or maybe the person is a sinner. They must have done something either in this life or in the previous life. That is why, or they're not prayerful enough. I heard a pastor say that. The reason why the person is depressed is because they're not prayerful enough. Let me say humorously that when I was in school, one of my favorite subjects in university, in medical college, was actually mental health. Okay, no brainer, right? I do mental health now, but back then, one of the symptoms of psychiatry that really baffled me, because I've been a Christian a long time, I was a Christian back then. One of the things that baffled me was one of the symptoms of psychiatric illness was excessive prayerfulness. People who are always in church, they're praying a lot. Most psychiatrists, some psychiatrists will see this as a red flag. It's not normal for you to abandon your children, abandon your responsibilities, abandon your mother, and you are in church. You are a wife or you're a husband. You leave everything and then you are in church. Monday, you are in church. Tuesday, you are in church. Wednesday, you are in church. That's not normal. And the pastors, and I see the pastors will be happy that this person is coming to church. But they don't realize that when I see that, for me, red flags start going around, So one of the things that I found and I'm going to be rounding up now because we want to give room for some questions. In the Afro-Caribbean community, when you begin to see a lack of emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, simply put, is being able to react appropriately in appropriate situations. All right, being able to make the right decisions. And this is something that you can grow in. We're all growing in that area. Now, if you wear beach shorts to a job interview, somebody's going to think that there's something wrong with you if you wear beach shorts. Even if you are and interviewing to be a lifeguard and you wear beach shorts to an interview, somebody's going to think there's something wrong with you. So it's knowing how to behave appropriately. When we begin to see inappropriate behavior, we need to remember, for those of us, we need to begin to think along the lines that maybe there's something going on. I'm going to round up. Last slide here, I just talked about innovations. Now this is, I need to share my slide, don't I? This, now we're talking about how medical science is now embracing stuff. There's something now called social prescribing. Some of you may be aware of it, where long story short is that, for the sake of our talk, activities such as getting involved with your local mosque, church, or temple, or a community group is now part of the prescription that the NHS is giving out to people, especially to people who suffer with mental health. Strange and interesting, isn't it? Because they found out that spirituality gives one a sense of hope. It gives you a better sense of well-being. That community group helps you to be released from isolation. Things such as mindfulness, meditation. I don't have time to talk about meditation because meditation can be good. Depends on what you're meditating on. But other things such as, that help to reduce isolation, getting people into choir groups, being prescribed by the NHS, flower arrangement, etc. So to round up, we can see that there's a strong interface between spirituality and mental health. And depending on how we approach this, we can benefit from it positively, but we can also take it to the extreme and it can affect us adversely. Thank you. Let's give room for some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was great. So we've had a few questions. I love some of the things you said, especially about the high tempo music making you.
I didn't say it. It was the research that said it. I can relate to
research.
That.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I can relate to praise and worship at church. Well, we've got a few questions, and thanks very much for your presentation, because it's opened quite a lot of questions and debate.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here about that. There are some people that are medicating their trauma by church, and is that in some instances not more acceptable than drugs?
Okay, that's a very good question, actually. So I will say this from a pastor's perspective and then from a doctor's perspective, if you like. Now, part of my presentation, if you notice that the last bit that I talked about, the spiritual, the positive aspects of spirituality, a lot of all those things there are actually some of the benefits you get from CBT, from cognitive behavior therapy, which is a form of therapy. So, or EMDR. Basically, you're going to get exactly the same thing. So one of the things I meant to say in my presentation is that church actually is a form of therapy on its own. However, you cannot medicate all of your trauma away just by going to church. This is part of what I was saying. In church is extremely, your mosque or your temple is extremely therapeutic for a lot of people who have suffered with traumas. That is now proven. That is a fact. So it's not necessarily if one is better. If it helps with the trauma and gets rid of it, great. Because I know a lot of pastor friends who are now going and taking counseling courses, secular counseling courses, in order to be able to better deliver their services to their congregation. Not every trauma can be medicated by the church. That's the point I'm making. That sometimes you need to go to a trained counselor who can dig deeper into, because we now know for a fact. I speak to pastors that are privileged to speak. A lot of pastors are not trained in this area of being able to give counseling and therapy. And I actually know a pastor who made things worse by his approach to a particular gentleman's trauma. And, you know, by the time it came to me, they came to me as a doctor, but because they were Christians, I figured it out. And I realized that this guy hadn't been listened to properly. They hadn't been dealt with properly. So I got them to speak to a trained counselor who wasn't even a Christian, and things became better. So yes, the church aspect of it, or the mosque aspect of it, is extremely therapeutic, but that doesn't apply to every single case.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question from the chat, and someone's asking, what do you mean when you say the term mental fitness?
Mental fitness.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what that person means. I define mental health. I didn't say mental fitness.
Okay.
So having a positive state of mental health is like my definition says, you know, because mental fitness is very, very arbitrary. Sometimes I'll make you guys laugh. When I wake up in the morning, like this morning, for example, I wasn't very mentally fit. I wanted to sleep a little bit more because I had a long week. I don't often use my glasses. I'm using my glasses now because my eyes are tired and I've been staring at a screen for the whole of the week. No, mental health is a state of well-being in which you are able to deal with the stresses of life. You're able to cope and then be productive. So mental fitness is varies. If you had too much alcohol on a Friday evening, you ain't gonna be mentally fit. If you eat too much fufu on a Wednesday night, there is a release of serotonin across the blood-brain barrier, and you're going to feel sleepy, and you're not going to be mentally fit. So we need to be careful how we throw words around. I didn't talk about mentally fit, I talked about mentally being well.
Okay, that's good. There's a question here about, do you think that, from what you said, I'm sure you'll agree with this, that more spiritual leaders should take on counseling training?
110%, 155%, absolutely. So I absolutely advocate that the best spiritual leaders are the ones who have been trained themselves. I have had the good fortune of being trained along those lines. And so it comes easy to me. You know, in our line of work, you're already doing stuff, but then I went and got even further training. So I absolutely, I've actually, through the work of CAHN and some of the pastors on here, we've started working on this. Pastor Charles, Pastor Emeka, I think Faye's been involved, where we've actually had forums. I've been privileged to speak in those forums where we've been trying to get pastors to engage in better training with regards to secular counseling and communication, not just counseling, but communication. So 110%.
Okay. There's a question here that there's someone who has been having some difficulties in fertility, but has been told that IVF is not spiritual.
Okay, I think, shouldn't I leave this to you, Ngozi, to answer? this is
I'm a neonatologist.
This is right up your street. Okay, well,
I'm a neonatologist. I think it's the same as any other medication, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's nothing wrong with IVF.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing wrong with IVF. From a biblical perspective, I think in Islam, I've heard my Muslim patients tell me that there are certain factions in Islam that frown against it. I don't know what the Hindus or the Buddhists think, but as far as Christianity is concerned, there's nothing in the Bible that says you can't do it.
Okay. I suppose, but it's the same concept really about the knowledge that God has given to mankind to help you overcome some of these medical problems. It's God-given knowledge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you can augment this with your faith and prayer.
Absolutely. Let me piggyback on that. Many people fail to recognize the fact that most medications actually came from natural products. You know, most medicines that we take were found in trees and plants and things like that. So if God didn't want us to use them, he wouldn't have put them there. So the fact is, it's just using the medical knowledge that we have to help and assist people. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that from my perspective, if using IVF or taking medication. I'll give you an example. In Western Africa, for example, I think it's the particular tree that has chloroquine in it, that has quinine in it, and it's used to treat. The locals distill it, they brew it. When the child has fever, they give it to them. Voila, the fever gets better. But it actually has quinine, which treats malaria. This is the northern part of Nigeria and some parts of West Africa. Hello. Now, what's happened is we've gotten smarter, we've put it into tablets, and we're not using it. So really, I agree with that. It's just part of how advancement of medical knowledge helps us to use what God has already given to us.
Okay. And I suppose the other question that's with that is that whilst you access medical care, there is something about your spirituality and prayer as well, isn't it? So so when people come to you with maybe really challenging illnesses, people have terminal cancer, what do you tell them to do?
Very good question, God. Thank you. So I was going to make this point, but I didn't want to seem make this look like a preaching session, which it can easily become with me. But we need to recognize, and this is a problem with a lot of people, true spirituality is every part of your life. Spirituality is not something you do on a Friday. Spirituality is not something you do on a Sunday morning or on a Wednesday or Thursday. Spirituality, if you practice properly, should engulf every single aspect of your life. So we really shouldn't be able to separate your spirituality from your day-to-day life. So if you're going for a surgical operation, please, by all means, pray. As a matter of fact, when my children were being delivered, I would often pray that God should give the doctors the skill and the right knowledge to be able to deliver my wife properly. I would often pray that the nurses are in a good mood and the midwives are happy and and the equipment does not fail. All right. So your spirituality, I said that in jest. We love our nurses. The nurses are always in the good mood, aren't they? But spirituality should be.
You're a realist.
That's what I am. Yes. Spirituality should be every part of your life. It's not something you compartmentalize and suddenly open up the box on a Sunday morning or on a Friday afternoon when you're going to the mosque, or, it should be part and parcel of every. So as you are taking your tablet, be praying. I'll give you an example. Let's call her Valerie for the sake of the argument. There's a young lady, 40 or 45, call her young lady, but there's a young lady who we gave her, she had hypertension, right? We gave her all the doses of blood pressure tablets we could. I was this close to referring her to a specialist. I think I actually did. And the specialist was like, let's try something else, but it still didn't work. So I had to call her back in. Long story short, I explored her mental health, she was deeply, deeply worried and afraid of certain things. So no matter what the tablet was, it wasn't going to work. And I think it's the same thing that while we are dealing with medical stuff, please don't ignore your spirituality. Your spirituality should be part and parcel of everything that you do.
Okay. There are a few comments, and I'll just read them out because they're supporting what you're saying. And thank you so much for the comments that you're putting in the chat. Please continue to put your questions as well. So this is someone just saying, and I'm saying this for the purposes of people on Zoom who are on YouTube who don't have access to the chat. So it says, thank you very much for your presentation. I've worked in this area and was surprised by some of the teaching within the church. Some people claim if you pray consistently that these things will go away. I believe teaching from the church, they should be trained properly. As often, some people don't have experience in these areas. Now you do because you're a medic and a pastor. And so they worry about the wrong things being taught. So they just wanted to pass on your thanks for that. There's another comment about spiritual leaders doing counseling training is really progressive because it means that there's a commitment to have therapy themselves, which is where change in understanding fundamentally takes place. So thanks for that comment, Pauline.
Thank you, Diana. Diana says, I'm a wise and intelligent gentleman. Thank you. I haven't been called that in a long time. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Diana. Thank you.
So there's another comment or question that says that there is that thanks for telling us about the spirituality influences our mental health. So how does your cultural belief influence your spirituality to influence your mental health? Because there is an influence of culture as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
Even in spirituality.
There is. This is a really, really good and loaded question. I'm worried that we won't be able to deal with it completely, but let me make an attempt. So here is the thing. Let me give you an example, because I think an example will probably bring it out more. There are people who go to church or the mosque, right? But they still go to the local witch doctor. That's because for them, culturally, the belief they really have is in the local witch doctor doing things. They see church or the mosque as an addendum. And so this is what I found in Manchester here, because a teenager told me about it. I didn't believe it until other people came up. Right after church, the father would take this family to the local herbalist in Manchester. I'm not talking about somewhere in Cambodia or Africa. So the problem is that because of the cultural belief that they had, the spirituality had not permeated into that cultural belief. Now, let's translate that into medical science. You can imagine then a doctor tells you that you've got diabetes, or that the cultural belief is that medication is wrong, or that medication is bad, or that people who take medication are weak. That person is not going to be compliant with that medication. So this is why I love these health hours, because hopefully we can begin to start a paradigm shift. We can begin to change our minds culturally and spiritually to begin to look at things. The very first time a few years ago, when I told people, a group of pastors, that you can take tablets and you can pray, they looked at me like, oh my goodness, heretic, where did you come from? But eventually I began to show them evidence of in the Bible and even, anecdotally. And so culturally, people are beginning to shift. But it's very, very important that we recognize, and this is for us also as healthcare professionals and even for the wider public, there are some people that have deep cultural beliefs that are still holding them down or are still influencing the way they think. And I think to a large extent, we need to be careful and understanding of that and help those kind of people come out of it.
Okay, thank you. What's your view? There's a question here about speaking in tongues.
Okay.
And I think the person who's asked the question is looking at what it means.
Speaking in tongues, well, this is purely for those who are Pentecostal Christians, because I grew up in the Church of England and we never spoke in tongues back in the day. But when I became a Pentecostal Christian, or when speaking in tongues is an element of prayer, for those who may not realize it. And it's a type of prayer where people pray in tongues or in languages that other people may not understand. It may be in a foreign language, or it may be in a different type of language where people are not able to understand. There's a passage in scripture that says, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels. The late evangelist Reinhard Bonnke was in a crusade in South Africa or somewhere, and somebody began to speak in tongues, but the tongues was very clear and very fluent Swahili. Now, if you know East Africa very well, there are different types of Swahili. It was a particular brand of Swahili that was spoken in that area. And so the guy was perplexed and said, please, other people around him who understood what was going on, because he didn't know what he was saying. People who understood what he was going on was like, he's speaking our language. So speaking in tongues is a manifestation, as the Christians believe, when you are overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, given in the right environment. And anybody who needs more information about that can contact me directly, and we can have a discussion about that.
Thank you. There's a comment stroke question about support that churches may give to people who are unwell. So it's a comment about maybe what this comment says is that they hide members who are ill from those who are concerned. So I'm trying to sort of think about what exactly they want to say with this. But anyway, I've just read it out as it is.
Yeah,
I understand what they're trying to say.
I know exactly what they're trying to say. You may not have been aware, but I was. During the COVID pandemic, there were lots of pastors who hid members who were COVID positive. and who hid the fact that some members were COVID positive. And unfortunately, two things happened. Some of those members died from COVID, and some of them infected other members because the pastor who knew about it hid it from other members.
Well, why would he hide it?
Well, so you need to understand the thinking behind this. When you preach positive messages on faith, we are encouraged to believe God, etc. Now, for those pastors, it is often seen as a sign of lack of faith or weakness that a church member has now gotten COVID. To them, because I've seen this play out I've been a Christian about 35 years. I've seen this play out over and over in different forms. I'm just using COVID because it's the most recent thing. It's really sad, really, really sad, Ngozi. But they believe that it's by extension, if somebody is ill or somebody is sick, it then means that maybe God is not with them in that church, or maybe their message is not powerful enough, or maybe they are not powerful enough as men of God. And so by extrapolation, not to be seen as weak or inept or incapable, they then hide those illnesses and make it less prominent. I saw this happen a long time. As a matter of fact, I'll say this, unfortunately, there was a church that was closed down in Manchester because of the high COVID rate that was going on, and they weren't taking COVID procedures. And the government had to step in and banned that particular ministry from ever operating in Manchester. But I know of churches where people died. I know of churches where people became more ill. Part of the reason was the leaders and the pastors knew about it and they kept it hidden. It's still part of what we're saying here, lack of understanding of illnesses and how we should relate to illness. We're talking about mental health. It happens with COVID, it happens with infection, it happens with diabetes, it happens with many things where people think it's a stigma. It's wrong for me who is spiritual to now have this illness. And I even had fear of losing reputation. Thank you. Yes, I had a couple of pastors come to me differently saying, oh, they were diagnosed with high cholesterol and they didn't want to take medication. And they didn't want anybody to know that they were diagnosed. I said to them, I had to call them aside and say, sir, this is one example. This chap had a stroke. Somebody I knew personally who was only in his early 40s. Nowadays, anybody in their early 40s seems like a baby to me, but I'm not saying anything. I'm not going to disclose my age. But early 40s having a stroke. By the time I gave this pastor so many examples, they then decided, you know what? I'm going to take medication, etc. So by and large, it's still a problem. And I have Muslim patients who refuse to divulge their mental health to their family members. The husband knew about it, the sister knew about it, but they didn't want the in-laws to know about it. They didn't want her parents to know about it because of the stigma that was associated with having mental health within that community. Oh, you want everybody to know my daughter is mad. You know, that's the thinking behind it. Let's not even go to our Jamaican or Nigerian brothers who feel that every mental illness means that, oh, you're running on the street naked. You know, that's the next stage, because that's what we see mental health as. That's why, if you notice in God, every time I talk about mental health, I try to define what mental health really is. And in one of my talks is on YouTube, I think CAHN has kindly put it on there. There are various types of mental health. And if you want to gain an understanding of that, please search it out and see that not every mental health is the psychotic type that people are running around, naked, etc. And so really that's important. As a matter of fact, most people who are suffering with mental health are undiagnosed. Some research put it as high as 1/3 of people who suffer with mental health don't even know that they have mental health.
Thank you. I suppose there's another comment here about, are there times that spiritual leaders can take part in group meetings in healthcare? Now, you've got an advantage because you're a GP, but are there any forums where you have the interplay between pastors, knowing what an influence they have on the community, and imams, that they support healthcare activities?
Yeah, so thank you. This is brilliant. And I may be a little bit biased in saying that CAHN has been doing a good job in this area. we've had forums where
no, you're not biased. They have been doing a good job. Full stop.
I'm unashamedly biased in saying that, you know, we've had forums where we've had faith leaders from different faiths. I was privileged to speak on one of those forums where we had different faith leaders and we talked about it. There was a project we did during the pandemic called Training the Trainers. I think Charles and Faye were championing this at the time, where we got a group of pastors together. So there are forums for this. If you need more information about this, please get in touch with CAHN. If you want us to come and speak in your organization or your group of organizations, please get in touch. But there are forums. It was more prominent during the pandemic, but from time to time, we do have sessions for faith leaders in particular, where we know that they need to get this information, they need to get this education, and you know, so we create that forum for them. So there are forums like that.
Thank you. There's another comment here. I think it's just a comment, but it says that every adult has a right to their health, so we shouldn't necessarily ascribe blame to pastors. You should do what your faith tells you to do, in a sense.
Okay.
However, I think this session here is because of the interplay between faith and health, isn't it? And that's why we're talking about it today.
Yes. So I like that statement, but let me just qualify this. See, many people underestimate the influence of leaders on followers. Let me take you back to history. How was Hitler able to get away with the things he got away with? He was a very eloquent leader, so people followed him. How did Mussolini get away with the things he got away with? How did, so pastors, there was a research that was done in America. I like research. I like because I don't just want to come and tell you my own personal opinion. There's a research that was done that for every 2 people that go to their doctor, this is going back 15 years, for every 2 people that go to their doctors for an illness, 5 have been to a spiritual pastor for the same thing. Don't underestimate the power of leadership. This is why we talk about talking to the leaders, because a lot of people will defer to their leaders more than even the healthcare professionals. I told you famously about the Zim, but this was the Zim, where is she from? Congolese lady. We prescribed blood pressure tablets. Yeah. And she said, I'm going to go ask my pastor. Now, unfortunately for her, her pastor was my friend. So I rang the guy up and said, oi, mate, someone's going to ring you and ask about medication. Tell her to take it. So people don't underestimate the power of our leaders, because a lot of people, yes, I agree 100%. People should take responsibility for themselves. But for a lot of people who have faith in their pastors, and rightly so, they should, the onus is now on leaders to make sure that they give the right advice. This is why I'm always learning and I'm always improving myself, because I want to make sure that I'm giving the best possible advice at every point in time.
Is there support for pastors out there, though, who want to be able to do this? Is it incumbent just on them? Or are there any sort of frameworks that they need to adhere to? Or is it up to the pastor themselves whether they decide to access some of these support services?
Yeah, so at the moment, to be fair, there isn't a lot of frameworks. There isn't an organized, but it's beginning to start. There are things that are now being set up. So really, at the moment, the onus is still on the pastors, the imams, the spiritual leaders, to go and get this training and to go and do that. It's not compulsory or by any stretch of the imagination. But if anybody who wants those kind of support, if they look for it, they will find it. But I agree and I admit it's not anywhere near enough of what it should be. But there are some structures in place.
Thank you. There was another specific question about, it says here, what is EMDR?
Oh, it's a form of therapy. It's like one of the talking therapies that you give. If you want the exact word, we can just Google it and tell you straight away. I don't keep those. I try to keep as less things as possible in my mind as possible. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Oh, that sounds really complex.
No, it's a psychological therapy that enables people to heal from their symptoms and emotional distresses of life. So basically, let's not get too technical. There are different types of psychotherapy. EMDR is just one of them. There is something called systemic desensitization. It depends on what sort of trauma you're dealing with, basically. If it's sexual trauma, for example, if it's alcohol abuse, there are certain therapies that are better for things like that. So you have cognitive behavior therapy. So there are lots of different types of therapy. EMDR is just one of them. Okay. We have a comment here about liaison with Pastor somebody. CAHN's faith liaison lead, Pastor Emmanuel. Yeah. Please do get in touch with him if you want to talk about faith-related engagement. Thank you for that. Yeah, I've been to a couple of those sessions myself where, I've been invited through CAHN. CAHN has facilitated it, and I've been invited to speak. But please get in touch with our faith liaison, Pastor Emmanuel, and he will clue you on to deal with that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. Just seeing if there are no other comments or questions. No. That's been fascinating as usual. Can I just invite people who are participating to fill in our poll, because we're really keen to gain some feedback on how you access these Saturday sessions and what you feel about them, and also suggestions for other topics that you would like in the future. So please fill in our feedback survey, because it continues to help us to refine this and make them even better. I think we will struggle to have a better session than we've had this morning, because this has been really insightful and has answered lots of questions that people have had. So thank you very much. I think most of the comments here are, there's another comment here just before we go. There's, is it possible to, what do we do with people who are depressed, and what language should we use to help their dementia, with their dementia? You're on mute.
Sorry, what do we do with people who are depressed? And depression and dementia are kind of two different things. Could you please repeat the question?
I think they're asking in relation to mental illness.
Okay, so that's
a broad category.
Yeah, that's a very broad. Basically, if you suspect someone is depressed, let's start with my talk today. If you're a spiritual person, you can start praying, all right? That's good. That's a good place to start. Very good place to start, all right? However, please do find them professional help. Make an appointment and go and speak to your local GP. They will be able to help you. More importantly, here in CAHN, we have a mental health unit, a mental counseling section. These guys are brilliant. I'm not just saying that. I work with them. These guys are absolutely brilliant. We have paid, trained counselors who will help you. They will triage your situation. They will signpost you to the right resources. I have been brought in a few times to deal with certain situations. But if you find somebody who is depressed within the community, and for whatever reasons, they're not able to go to a regular GP, but by all means, get in touch with CAHN, and we'll be able to help you out with that.
Thank you. Okay. Any last words? I always think it's nice to sort of have a message that you'd like people to take away with them today.
Yes, thank you, Ngozi. I do. Well, I think the crux of my message today is the fact that there is an interchange between spirituality and mental health, for sure. There are positive interactions and there are negative interactions. Being spiritual does not preclude anyone from suffering with a mental health disorder. And having a mental health disorder does not preclude you from being spiritual. Let me just say that, as by way of a last word, please do not isolate yourself or hide anything that you may be feeling. If you are not getting the help that you need, or you know somebody who's not getting the help that you need, please, please, please go and get someone to speak to. And that's one of the things that CAHN is looking to do, to bridge the gap between the available resources and the needs within the community. So please don't suffer in silence.
Thank you. That's a nice way to end. I'm going to hand over to the CAHN team now But Dr. Joe, thank you so much for your talk. It was excellent as usual.
Thank you. Thank you, Ngozi.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Ngozi. Massive thanks to Dr. Joseph for this informative session on spirituality and mental health. Doctor, thanks a lot for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And a massive thanks to our wonderful host as usual, Dr. Ngozi, for always hosting this session in such a brilliant manner. We really appreciate you as well. Massive thanks to our CATHIP partners, all our CATHIP partners, and to all our attendees on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. You can access Dr. Joe's slides for today's session by emailing health@CAHN.org.uk. Right, we have some exciting upcoming events. Next slide, please. So we are back again next Saturday for our CATHIP Health Hour session. Same time, same link, and the topic is where do stones form in the human body, and this will be led by Dr. Kamara. Next slide, please. Join us next Tuesday for our Healthy Heart session from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And the guest speaker will be Jasmine Carbon. The topic will be on what is your relationship with food. Next slide, please. All right, CAHN in collaboration with other organizations invite you to an audience with the Chief Constable, Stephen Watson, on 21st of November. Please visit eventbrite.com for registration. Next slide, please. Please visit our website for our excellent counseling services and also for our family and advocacy support services. You can do so by emailing help@CAHN.org.uk or call 07710 022 382. The number again is 07710 022 382. Next slide, please. Join our wonderful CATHIP partners or get in touch with them if you live in these regions. The first one is Caribbean and African Health Network, that is CAHN. The next one is Black Health Initiative, BHI. Next one, please. Croydon BME Forum. Next, please. Enfield Caribbean Association. Next, please. And the Royal Assembly Redeemed Christian Church of God. Thanks. The last one is RAFA International Development Agency. So thanks everyone for being with us today, and have a lovely, lovely weekend. Over to you, Comsteve. Comsteve, over to you.
To our Caribbean and African Targeted Health Improvement Program, CATHIP Health Hour. The Caribbean and African Health Network, CAHN, along with its national partners, are incredibly pleased to continue to bring to you targeted health and well-being education delivered by Caribbean and African doctors. These health hours are all about empowering, educating, and giving space to Black people so our communities can look after themselves better. Every Saturday, our Black GPs or consultants present on those health and well-being topics that affect you, your family members, and friends. Some weeks will vary and will include other panel members such as pharmacists, specialist nurses, and faith leaders. Our health hours cover a range of topics and include mental health, heart health, women's health, reproductive and sexual health issues, men's health, respiratory problems, cancer, sickle cell, and many more. We have not forgotten to include within our health hours the many societal, cultural, religious, and racial challenges that can go hand in hand with health problems and influence how we should respond to meet health and well-being needs. The sessions are designed for you, and we want you to use the time to listen, learn, share your experiences, and ask questions to our Black doctors. During every session, we will gather your feedback so we can continue to respond to the needs of our Black community. To request any particular topic, please email health@cahn.org.uk. We encourage you to invite others to our Health Hour sessions. Spread the word in our community. CATHIP is funded by the National Lottery Community Fund.